When you think of the word monster, you probably think of these scary out of this world beings, people that commit acts of evil, or Rick Ross when he sees a double chicken sandwich. But when I hear that word, something else comes to mind. Something that people try to be on their way to the top. People who have abandoned their humanity to now stand as a figure. And ultimately people who experience a different type of hell than the rest of us. Okay. If you don't get the point by now, sports past that basic surface level view can get dark. Like really dark, and my interest being in how that journey slowly devolves over time. You see, now that sports psychology has developed well past the who has a bigger dick contest between the Soviet Union and the USA, numerous studies have come out proving that athletes of any level are more susceptible to severe psychological issues than the average person, due in part to the numerous stress factors involved in playing a sport. Now, I didn't just wake up one day and just decide to research this shit out of the blue. I mean, you know, that would be weird, right? Outside of the fact the importance of psychology would literally get pounded into my head during the 7 years that I did boxing, since January of this year, I've been trying to read as many different types of sports related series that I can, ranging from your typical football and basketball stuff all the way to traditional Japanese card games like Karuta. And even though not all were worth my time, I still don't know what the fuck this is. These series surprised me in simply how raw and dare I say profound they were, giving me so many different messages that went beyond just the sport it's based on. And I think a reason I could take these stories so seriously when discussing a topic like sports psychology is because they're written by people who are so passionate about the sports they write about due to their own experiences with it, and therefore are able to create such grounded and relatable characters, the good ones anyway. And the importance of that is evident in just how huge of an impact these series have had. Whether that be people like Takehiko Inoue, who almost single-handedly popularized basketball in Japan through his series Slam Dunk, or more recently people like Furudate, the author of Haikyuu, whose effect, outside of also massively increasing the popularity of volleyball, can be seen in the Olympics currently going on, with a study just coming out proving that Gen Z has the most interest in volleyball out of all the sports currently being held. The study itself citing that Haikyuu was a huge factor in this. And just a quick side note, am I the only one that thinks it's insane that the players, the fans, and the people doing the music are fanning over Haikyuu in the Olympics? People, like, talk about impact. And taking the words right out of the mouth of the players in the Japanese volleyball team, it's because these characters are so realistic that they can be so heavily impacted by them. And more specifically, this fascination I had with the idea of how something that can start off so freeing can end up being so chaining, a surprisingly common theme in all of these stories. And maybe at first the idea might come across as boring, but when you break this idea down even further, you see how much more alluring that concept becomes. Escapism, the descent into chaos, those monsters that we try to be, self-reinvention, and that 10%. All things that I saw in myself, and I think a lot of you will too. And that, my friends, is essentially what I want to explore in this video. Sorry for that long and really abstract intro for no reason, but with that, there's no better place to start than understanding what the initial appeal of sports actually is. The tendency to seek distraction and relief from unpleasant realities, especially by seeking entertainment. The fancy way of saying that being escapism. Just think about all the times you've wanted to play something outside of the realm of competition, whether it's during lunch breaks at school, after work, or in other spare moments. It's always been to escape something, to have fun. But why exactly is that? You see, outside of hardcore drugs, don't do drugs kids, sports is one of the few places that provides an optimal environment for the distractions of unpleasant realities I mentioned. A simple and precise goal, immediate feedback, high amounts of physical activity leading to endorphins popping off left, right and center, which naturally elevate your mood, all work together to make it by far the most superior form of escapism we can find today, while still having our agency being actively involved. And going beyond that, the most optimal environment for people to enter the zone, a mental state of complete immersion, heightened focus, and optimal performance in an activity. E.G. Rick Ross when he sees a double chicken sandwich. That being said, this doesn't happen to everyone, and even when it does, it's not a long-term effect. But as Galloway puts it, the author of, in my opinion, one of the best sports psychology books out there, although you can't demand to enter it because it's a thoughtless process by nature, you can ask, and understanding that it's the perfect environment for such an occurrence to happen is enough to highlight why losing yourself in it is such a strong appeal, even if it's an unconscious one. The person that actually named this concept the zone, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, I'm giving myself a round of applause for even trying to pronounce that name, advocates for this as one of, if not the most important factor in our pursuit of happiness. The best moments usually occur when a person's body or mind is stretched to its limits in a voluntary effort to accomplish something difficult and worthwhile. Optimal experience is thus something we must make happen. happen. And this idea of escapism and sports is something I really wanted to mention, mainly because of how often you find it to be the focus of these stories. It adds a huge emotional stake to the point that what would usually be someone just losing another game instead becomes the destruction of somebody's paradise. And you feel that. More specifically, I'd say the time this idea really impacted me the most was when I read The Climber for the first time earlier this year. And holy created by the absolute madman Shinichi Sakamoto, The Climber is a story based on a novel with the same name by Hiro Nita, which depicts the real-life experiences of Bintaro Kato, a solo mountain climber in the early 1900s, and therefore falling into the category of manga loosely based on real historical figures, which always so happens to end up being amazing. And I'm happy to report that The Climber fits right in, even though the plot is based on the opposite of fitting in. Do you get it? Because no, that was a bad joke. I don't even know why I tried. Mori, the protagonist, is on a mission to climb the K2, the second tallest but simultaneously hardest mountain in the world to climb, which also so happens to have never been done before. Honestly, there are so many things about the story that I love, and if I was to say all of them, it would probably go on for hours, but keeping to the topic at hand, at the start of the story, Mori isn't exactly normal. You see, imagine the most emo, socially awkward Sasuke wannabe, then times that by 100. When Mori first joins this new high school, it's clear to see for everybody that he's both an extreme introvert that craves loneliness, and without spoiling the details, somebody who carries a lot of baggage. That characterization is what defines him throughout the manga, as he's described to be somebody who no matter where he goes, will always be alone. And that's clear to see from his cold, lifeless face all the way to his bland and short dialogue. But that all changes when he's introduced to climbing for the first time. His face lights up, transforming into a different person right before our eyes. Even though his lonely, introverted demeanor never really changes, panels like this show that he's clearly escaped his mundane reality, fully absorbed in the adrenaline rush and pure joy that comes with scaling new heights. Also want to mention that this guy is borderline insane since he tried to climb his 10-story school building as a dare without a harness. There's probably some psychological depth to why climbers crave these thrills that I'm probably missing, but in essence it's somewhat similar to the zone I described earlier, just adding a shit ton of adrenaline and life or death fear into the equation. It's these early moments in the manga that really stuck with me, because I remember prior to this I'd never really thought about sports in terms of escapism. I usually only thought about it when it comes to health, self-improvement, or an opportunity to be something good, I don't know, something like that. And outside of that making me realize how stupid and one-dimensional my thinking was, it kind of feels like something clicked, and it's a recurring theme throughout the series that Mori is able to escape into the abyss through mountains and climbing to indulge further and further into his own loneliness, going beyond just an escape to something more primal about a man being absorbed back into nature. And I think all this can be summarized beautifully by the author himself. There is the idea that in the harshness of nature there is also beauty. The best times to ask questions, to think, are those when you find yourself alone. Somehow it is by being alone that he realizes that he is linked to others. This solitude is very important because it is what allows us to understand certain things, and which allows us to find solutions for living. This is how Bintaro will move forward. And just like he says, as the series constantly pushes for, Mori can't sustain his journey while simultaneously staying alone. You see, even a sport as individualistic as climbing requires human support to some extent, whether that be through sponsors to fund his journey, coaches, fellow climbers, or just knowing that there's somebody in this world waiting for you to come home. And this is where we see how this obsession with climbing slowly transitions from escapism to becoming a source of confrontation, as the years he spent gradually isolating himself from society and using climbing to immerse himself in his loneliness finally manifest. It becomes clear how much of a monster Mori has become. One quote from the opening chapters that really haunted me for a while came out of the mouth of one of the teachers that had actually introduced Mori to climbing, telling him, "You're already in love with mountains. You can't go back now." And it was here that I realized just how easily something you love can be a chain, something that you're a slave to. Ultimately, climbing had become something closer to a curse that had taken away his humanity. Now, of course, the story doesn't end there, and you can find out where it goes, since everything I said is only the early part of the manga, and trust me, it goes a lot of places that I promise you wouldn't expect. But the point I wanted to get across is that using sports as a form of escapism will never last. And that's something that also seems to ring true with other athletes. One of my biggest inspirations for making this video was an article I found in 2016 called The Dark Side of Top Level Sport, which aimed to explore the complex relationship between depressive experiences and performance in elite athletes by analysing 12 autobiographies across 8 different sports. And a lot of what it says seems to back up my own vague conclusion, stating that for many of the athletes, their sport had once been a positive form of escape from the emotional difficulties they were experiencing, but that as their depressive experience intensified, it became apparent that sport was no longer the sanctuary that it had been. Examples of this include athletes like Aubrey, nicknamed the Flying Scotsman, which I don't know why. Really funny. An elite Scottish racing cyclist who recounted using powerful imagery that training seemed like nothing short of bloodless self-mutilation. Aubrey and many other examples lead the study to conclude that sports does initially serve as an effective escape from depression, but eventually exacerbates the athlete's symptoms due to increasing demands. And it's interesting to see how many of these stories go back to that idea that eventually it can no longer sustain that paradise that one initially finds so appealing about it, with the cause of this being two things outside of the loneliness exemplified by Maury: the value of achievements in modern society and the monsters that create them. A point I want to make based on both my own real life experiences and the transformative journey I had whilst reading Slam Dunk, starting with the latter. To keep it brief, Slam Dunk is a story revolving around the protagonist, Sakuragi, a delinquent that knows absolutely jack shit about basketball, but joins his school basketball team to impress a girl he likes. But what's really fun about the series is Shohoku High's basketball team, a group mainly made up of rejects, all trying to come together to conquer the nation. Now that being said, Sakuragi, Ryota, Rukawa, Kogure, and Akagi were all characters that I absolutely adored, but my favourite character on the team by far was a guy by the name of Mitsui Hisashi, a character that had gone from once adoring basketball to now detesting it with his entire being. You see, once upon a time he was an extremely talented three-point shooter who had even won the MVP during his days in middle school, and for somebody like that it was only natural that going into high school he had the insane ambition of taking his team all the way to the top of the country. However, sadly in his first training session back he got a really bad leg injury, partly due to an intense rivalry that quickly developed with Akagi, somebody with the same ambition and passion for the sport as him, and it's here where basketball starts to devolve into something else. He rushes his healing process, desperately trying to be on time for the qualifiers. However, sadly in rushing he injured himself even further, becoming something much more serious. If it's not clear by now, the stress is building up, and eventually when watching his team win the qualifiers without him and seeing Akagi perform well, as well as now being unsure when his leg will heal, he quits the sport, now detesting what he once loved. Now Inoue never actually gives an exact reason as to why he starts hating it outside of this panel and the facial expression he has when walking away, which I find really interesting because it almost suggests a natural evolution of somebody's relationship with the sport when quitting in such a manner. Almost like this hatred is a form of justification, that he was right in leaving. Regardless, Mitsui ends up going down the wrong path, turning into just a full-on gangster and even bullying other basketball players he sees out of pure spite. Now that being said, Mitsui's story isn't a complicated one by any means. As a matter of fact, after watching the first Slam Dunk, I think Ryota probably has the most interesting and unique backstory of the six, but I think why Mitsui stood out to me so much were for two reasons in particular. One, that as a huge Inoue fan, cannot express enough that he's probably my favourite artist of all time. It's clear that Mitsui was a turning point for him as a writer, as it was after introducing him that Slam Dunk had now went from being a family-friendly comedic basketball series to shifting into a story with a much more serious tone. And that becomes even clearer after seeing the way he describes his relationship with Mitsui, saying on a radio show that Mitsui wasn't originally a character he had planned to have as a part of the team and give so much attention, but found himself becoming more and more attached to his character as the series went on. And I don't know what it is, but I love it whenever an author describes his relationship with the character slowly evolving as he sees more of himself in them. And this is especially true for Inoue because I swear if you've read any of his other works like I have a million times, you can see that Inoue has a big soft spot for delinquents, or more specifically, outcasts trying to make their way through society after either being struck by an extreme tragedy or just ruining themselves. With, in my opinion, his most profound message across all his works being that no matter what hole you've dug yourself into, you can always make it out, and all of that starts with Mitsui. Just want to quickly shout out this creator who makes an entire video surrounding this idea. Has to be one of my favorite video essays of all time. Also the actual video that inspired me to start reading Slam Dunk this year, so just felt like I had to shout him out. The link will be in the description. And the second reason for my attachment to Mitsui's story, this time on a more personal level, stems from a lie I've already told in this video. You see, I didn't do boxing for 7 years. Well, not accurately anyways. When I was 12, I came across a little series called Hajime no Ippo, a story following Ippo Makinuchi, a shy high school student who gets bullied and works at his family's fishing boat. One day he's saved from getting his ass beat by Takamura, a pro boxer, and being inspired by him and the world of boxing, Ippo begins training at Kamigawa Gym. And yes, I remember being enthralled by Ippo's journey of self-reinvention, which is a very important word I'll come back to later in the video, but more specifically by Takamura, who blew my 12-year-old mind. I wish I could make it sound deeper, but the truth is he was just so cool, like look at this shit most of the time. And although the fact never changed that this guy was basically my hero growing up, as we get deeper and deeper into the narrative, it becomes clearer and clearer that Takamura completely embodies the monster ideal that I've slowly been mentioning throughout the video, but like to the most extreme extent possible. Fun fact, the guy literally fights the bear and wins. Nope, there's no superpower bullshit in the show. He just straight up kept punching a bear in its forehead until it fell, and then lets it live in a really heartfelt and emotional moment, only for an old man that he was staying with at the time to find the bear weakened, kill it and cook it, and force Takamura to eat it as he cries. Genuinely, by the way, just like, this is actually one of the funniest series I've ever watched. But I'm going a bit off topic. After rewatching the series 20 times, I had decided that I myself really wanted to be like him, as cringy as that sounds, which launched me into the endeavor of boxing, where it started out amazing, and like most beginners, you get better so fast, build connections, and that escapism I mentioned, it was another world. I mean, a very unhygienic world, because holy shit, if you've been to any combat sports gym, but eventually that escapism and fun becomes a source of stress and anxiety, as I wanted to be one of those monsters. I wanted to achieve the impossible. My grades started getting lower. I couldn't spend time with my friends, isolating myself. Sparring sessions that people wouldn't and shouldn't take too seriously because, you know, it's sparring, became life or death situations in my head, as how I performed in that reflected my entire self-worth. And that feeling persisted even after hundreds and hundreds of rounds of sparring so many years later. It also didn't help that I was like 6'2" and 120 kg when I was 13, so getting fights was really hard. And after 4 years of going from gym to gym, the stress and anxiety got to me, and I finally left detesting boxing with all my heart, a sport that I once loved. And even though the story doesn't end there, I hope that conveys why I felt Mitsui's journey in my soul. And you see, I also bring this up as that's an outcome a lot of studies acknowledge, stating that athletes' impossible standards transform sports from a paradise into a source of stress and torment. This relentless pursuit of perfection instills fear of failure, shame and embarrassment, transforming sports into a crucible of stress and despair. And it's those people in your field that stand at the top, those monsters that create these impossible standards. But everything I just said is one perspective, because when we look deeper into these monsters, you see that they can't be entirely bad, right? Because eventually it was those monsters that brought Mitsui back, giving him another chance, and most importantly, a changed perspective, giving birth to a new relationship with the sport, one that takes into account his individuality and what matters to him. These impossible standards transforms into a personal appreciation for the sport. He's inspired by people like Sakuragi, Rukawa, Ryota, and Akagi, who all have such diverse motivations, and it's because of that Mitsui learns to value personal growth and effort, ultimately finding fulfillment in the journey rather than just the outcome. All of this so far feels like a big intro into what I think the right way to engage in sports is, and to a certain extent life. I don't think suffering is the right way to reach the top, nor to engage with any endeavor. But in order to really get the idea and explain it properly, there's one last thing we need to understand. Who are these monsters living amongst us who set these impossible standards, whether they be in sport or in life? Every single series I read had this concept of a monster ingrained into its core thematics in one way or another. Somebody that went beyond their humanity to now stand as a figure. And whilst each of these figures were quite different, whether they were hotheads, golden retrievers, or, you know, just plain emos, they were always portrayed as abnormalities. People like Mori who decide to climb up his school without a harness, not giving a care in the world whether or not he turns into a pancake. But you know, Mori is kind of a psychopath. So a more normalish example of this would be somebody like Sakuragi, has absolutely dog shit technique at the start of the series, but through his mentality, physicality, and just plain unpredictability is able to make just as much of an impact on the core as Rukawa, somebody who's considered to be a prodigy. And one of the things that had me so interested in exploring the psyche through sports in the first place is how these people at the top are still ostracized, and like I said, left to suffer in a different type of hell than the rest of us. And the more you see this, the more you start to agree with the conclusion I found in the article that athletes are much more prone to suffering regardless of what level they're at. This concept mainly came to me when I watched the Last Dance documentary way after the hype had went down. It was specifically this moment that really got to me. This is kind of awkward. I kind of realized whilst editing that I can't show you guys this clip for copyright purposes, but to summarize what this moment was, essentially Michael was crying at the idea that he plays the way he does, at the intensity that he does, and anyone that can't match that should simply stop playing. Now listen, I'm not a basketball expert, so I can't tell you much about his life outside of the details of this documentary, but I think this moment stood out to me because it's representative of what the archetype of strength and loneliness is all about. A journey that those who want to be strong have to pursue. This insane loneliness that comes with the pursuit of excellence, and it's mainly due to those uncompromising standards. Not everyone can match that mentality, that strength, and eventually it's going to hurt, regardless of how welcoming and positive one can be, because it's simply not normal. Take Bokuto for example, my favourite character in Haikyuu and the nicest guy you're ever going to meet, and somebody whose entire philosophy is based around the idea that he simply wants volleyball to be as fun as possible. And in order to have that freedom, he has to be really good and therefore work hard, pushing that ideal onto characters like Tsukishima and Hinata throughout the story. But even with all his positivity, he still eventually finds himself ostracized and alone. And I mean, from a logical perspective, taking stardom out of the equation, it's not hard to see why. The obsession and sacrifice it takes to do the impossible, like climb the top of the K2, haiku would naturally exclude you from society. It just takes too much away from you. Now take everything I just said and let's just pretend it's complete and utter bullshit. And not just any type of bullshit, my grandma's cooking type of bullshit. Rest easy, granny. Rather, let's look at somebody else's perspective, that monsters simply don't exist. Not how we normally think they do anyways. One of the many ideas that haiku explores. I feel like I've really milked summaries in this video, so I'm just going to leave it as: little guy wants to be good at sport with tall people, aka volleyball, and makes commitment to beat prodigy Kageyama in middle school. Plot twist, only for them to end up on the same team, a team that has fallen off, Kurasuno High, and now try to reach nationals together. And just in case the following section doesn't make it clear, this series is one of the most life-changing media I've ever come across. Furudate, I don't know how you managed to make a story about boys playing volleyball give me the answer to life's most daunting questions, but I love you. The word monster is thrown around a lot in haiku, but it's most commonly used to describe those perceived to have an unrivaled talent for the sport, similar to how I just described it. But most interestingly, you see this idea through the juxtaposition of the captains of Aoba Josai and Inurazaki, Toru Oikawa and Shinsuke Kita, two of the antagonists in the series. Oikawa is somebody who is constantly seen to have an inferiority complex to those he perceives to be monsters, to those with real talent. People like Ushiwaka from Shiratorizawa or Tobio Kageyama of Kurasuno High. It also nicely parallels and contrasts Hinata's journey, as both center around the idea of compensating for what they lack compared to others. However, the difference being that Hinata has a much more optimistic outlook, as he never believes that he can't match their talent. Rather, he looks for an opportunity to fight and therefore constantly tries to expand and improve his weapons. Whilst Oikawa interprets his journey negatively, feeling the pressure and frustration of constantly having to make up for his deficiencies. And it's because of that Oikawa is both consciously and unconsciously putting people like Kageyama and Ushiwaka on a pedestal, creating an even further gap between them, whilst Hinata is slowly closing in. Oikawa's character was the first time in the series that we really questioned whether or not superior beings actually exist, people born better, and whether or not trying to catch up to them is simply a losing battle. And that view remains the case until this idea is ultimately destroyed in one of my favourite matches in the series, Kurasuno High versus tournament favourites Inurazaki. During the match, Kita, the captain of Inurazaki, is spoken to about the idea that the Miya twins, Otsumu and Atsumu, two of the best high school players in the country, are simply people born better, people born as monsters. One of, if not the most important question in the series. And he responds to that statement by calling it rude. You see, Kita provides an interesting perspective in haiku that results are simply byproducts of what we do every day, and therefore he has no true care for them, as they are what they are. Because more importantly, it is the process that defines us. Waking up in the morning, cleaning your room, brushing your teeth, the food you eat, and training at the same time every day, it's those things that make up Kita's identity, and the byproducts of that are simply meant to happen. Outside of that view being integral in breaking down Oikawa's belief, it's also very in line with a book I read recently called The Inner Game of Tennis by Galloway, who I previously mentioned, a book about the psychological battle that comes with playing sports. In the book, he tries to explain that the most optimal performance can be gained by discarding thoughts completely. And in that argument, one of the points he makes is that non-judgmental awareness, not labeling our results or actions to be good or bad, lessens distractions and internal conflict, allowing one to maintain a more focused state of mind, and therefore can be in the present moment as much as possible, which is what the zone I mentioned earlier is really all about. And that's why the twins are so perfect for showcasing the theme, as although both are genetically identical, Atsumu is just able to surpass his brother, going on to be picked to represent Japan because of his slightly more passion for the sport, showing how even a small difference in effort and commitment is enough to make that big of a difference. And expanding on that, there's two moments in haiku that resonate deeply with me, both revolving around these monstrous beings. The first one stemming from the Little Giant theme, with Koroi, Hinata and the Little Giant himself all coming together to push forth the idea that the world is both unfair and brutally fair. And we really see that encapsulated in Koroi when he says that being short is not a sign of incompetence. It is not a sign that you haven't worked hard enough. You can still hone the weapons that are available to you, and the people who actually manage to do that are the ones that we refer to as monsters. Now that's all just build up to what the actual moment is. The moment I'm specifically referring to here is the quote, "What will you become tomorrow?" Everyone has to come face to face with setbacks, and it's the quote that always plays in my mind, even weeks after I've finished haiku now. Everyone has to come face to face with setbacks, but what will you do after that? And most importantly, this doesn't have to be a source of stress like it becomes for so many people. And it's for that reason that Oikawa's petty pride, the second moment I'm referring to, was such a profound moment for not just his character but the entire series as a whole, as it's an affirmation of the statement that was told to him by the person he looks up to, a strength that I never had when I left boxing so many years ago. And it's for that reason that Oikawa also stands as one of these monsters on the court, getting to the conclusion that he can't say that he can't catch up until he's actually tried. And that overlaps very nicely with another huge theme in one of my favourite series, and the concept of self-reinvention, which in my opinion is the most important concept when it comes to sports. The action or process through which something is changed so much that it appears to be entirely new. That something being yourself. Now there's a key aspect here that's missing in this bridge between sports, you, and the self-reinvention I'm referring to, and that's vulnerability. Now I spoke a lot about that specific concept in my video about shoujo, so I'm not going to dive as deep as I did there so I don't expose the fact that I am truly a one-trick pony, but I'll give an example of what I found to be the most profound and impactful example of this in an absolute all-timer series, Shihayafuru, and also feel free to check out that shoujo video after. I'm just gonna I'm gonna leave the link in the description if you're interested. Shihayafuru is a josei sports manga that revolves around Karuta, a traditional Japanese card game that is played competitively, which typically involves matching cards with poetry verses as they're being read, and Chihaya, the protagonist, building a team to both compete on an individual and team level with a focus on trying to restore past feelings and connections. Now wait! Listen, on a surface level, this might not seem that interesting, but my lord, trust me, this shit had me sweating. By the time you've dipped your feet into Shihayafuru, every game becomes as intense as watching Hagler vs Hearns, where in 3 rounds they threw nearly 200 punches, which is insane because a lot of boxing matches these days barely get to 300 after 12 rounds, meaning that this was a match of pure and utter hatred, with the winner not only becoming a champion, but proving that they are in fact the superior specimen. So yeah, this shit raised my blood pressure, and I like boxing. Throughout the series, I found myself gravitating towards a character called Taichi, and I think he serves as a really good case study for this video. He's also probably the most complex character in the series, and you know me, a pretentious that only likes complex, well-written characters that I can write 10,000 words about. By the way, this is my favorite character of all time, genuinely, like.
Because you're a heavyweight where it counts the most, below the belt, right? Believe me, the biggest thing always wins it in the ring.
Yeah. But whilst the concept of only being allowed to say you're not good enough at something after you've actually tried is the conclusion of Oikawa's journey, we see that this is the start of Taichi's, which allows us to see it from a little bit of a different angle, enough to make a different point. In the opening chapters of the series, we see that Taichi from a young age had a reputation for being talented at most things, whether they be academic or sports, and this is primarily because he grew up with the mentality that he has to be the best at something in order to do it. As if he wasn't, it simply wasn't worth his time, a mentality implemented in him by his own mother. And this was something he was clearly content with until that identity finally shatters as the person he loves, Chihaya, finds a passion that he is not good at. Karuta, with Arata, somebody he sees as a rival, also proving himself to be superior. And it's because of that, when put in a match against him, he does something that he's ashamed of, cheating by stealing Arata's glasses, leaving him blind and unable to play the match, devolving this outlook he had of himself as the best into now just being a coward. Now to you that might not seem that big of a thing, but to Taichi this absolutely shattered his entire identity and like basically gave him trauma. Like I'm just gonna say it how it is. And this outlook of himself as a coward is something that remains in the back of his head for the following years of his life, and it leaves Taichi with the burden of not allowing himself to get invested in things outside of the things he's already good at. But this time, instead of because of his ego, it was out of a fear of getting hurt. Eventually, many years later, he does reunite with Chihaya, and like everybody else that meets her, is overwhelmed by her passion, which draws everyone into her world. But even then, he still tries to fight this urge to play again, as he can't get over the idea that he can never match up to prodigies like Arata. And without giving a sob story, this is something I and probably a lot of you can relate to heavily: the struggle of getting attached to something that isn't going to last long term, or worse, possibly hurt you. So you end up creating a barrier, and this entire reaction usually stemming from an experience that you had in the past. And to some degree, honestly, I can't bring myself to call it stupid. Wrong, but not exactly stupid. I'm not smart enough to think of a very specific word here, but something along the lines of just sad. However, through the sport of Karuta, Shihayafuru is a story that critiques that mentality. You should throw yourself at things. No. You have to, whether that be a sport, people, or a thing you love. And the start of Taichi's journey, the want to change, starts with my favorite moment in the opening chapters. In chapters 6 and 7, whilst Taichi watches Chihaya compete for the first time in years, Dr. Harada, the president of the Karuta club the three played at when they were younger, responds to Taichi's statement of saying that he could devote his entire life to Karuta and still never be better than a prodigy like Arata, with a very simple line of eyelashes, say that once you've done it. And I know it seems like I'm just repeating that Oikawa point over and over, but I think there's a clear difference enough to warrant me bringing up Taichi in that Oikawa's journey is a more external battle, one of trying to overcome monstrous obstacles, but with Taichi there seems to be much more of a focus on self-acceptance and understanding the value of your own journey. Ultimately, Shihayafuru is about passion to the most extreme extent possible, and more importantly, what that passion brings outside of simply winning and losing, and an attempt to prove that those reasons are why you should throw yourselves at things. This stood out to me the most when I was reading reading interviews from Suigetsu, the author of the series, speak about what made her so passionate about writing a series like this. I also went to observe a number of high school tournaments. Seeing the students who lost on the tatami with tears running down their faces really left a strong impression in my heart. Karate is one of those competitions that don't draw much attention, but they were still so passionate and serious about it. I think that my manga improved in leaps and bounds simply because I saw those scenes, and it's only through Taichi opening himself up to the embarrassment of fear and failure that he can start that journey. At its core, these stories show how transformative these endeavors can be, whether that be for the better or the worse. And as sports manga are evolving, we're seeing how much more of an emphasis is being put on this topic. The most popular example right now being Blue Lock, with the entirety of the story focused on the relationship between the development of one's ego and how that impacts the way you play, and most importantly, you as an individual. But I think what separates people from either side of the spectrum, big baby bitch versus this Chad, comes down to the points that Galloway mentions in his book, which is the value that you yourself place on it. At its core, these books advocate for reconnecting with our childlike state, embracing the pure, unfiltered joy and emotional freedom that comes with experiencing life with the wonder and playfulness of a child, as it's there where you are the most thoughtless and empty, that you can be filled up with new outlooks and ideas, whether that be for learning new techniques, which is the example that Galloway gives, or something more important. Also find it really funny how he keeps using hippos to explain these ideas. Don't know why I felt the need to mention that, but it was really funny whilst I was reading it. And expanding on that, as you can tell, in making this video I looked at numerous authors discussing these series and what they meant to them. But by far my favourite came in a documentary series called We Become Stronger with the Manga, I love that name, which aimed to highlight the impact that different series have had on their communities. The one that I found the most impactful being the one that covers Haikyuu. Skipping all the stuff I've already mentioned in this video, about midway through, we finally get a comment from Furodate where he explains what his reasoning for writing Haikyuu was, saying that back in high school, volleyball was everything to me, but I never managed to make the most out of it, and a feeling of incompleteness never left me. He wasn't satisfied with how his journey ended, but I think Furodate's quote really stood out to me because it kind of highlights what I've been trying to say in this video, and it's when ending the documentary and revisiting Furodate, I feel like I found the answer to something deep within my heart, a conclusion that Furodate reached in his own journey. Drawing manga is only about 10% fun, but those moments when you hit those 10% are just too good to be true, so I draw to experience them again. I want boys to think volleyball is so cool. I think as humans, what we do is live for those 10%, whether we realize it or not, hoping that one day we'll get to experience those same joys that we felt throughout our lives. And sorry to get a bit corny here, but to me, that's what art is all about. Simply an attempt to recreate these moments to the best of our ability. And when you combine that with sports, where through its simplicity, we can create these childlike wonders again, it's almost like you get this insane chemical reaction of emotions, intensity, beauty, and a lot of other things. And I think it's here through these stories you can connect sports to a broader theme, live with others, live to standards that you create, live with your head held high, and most importantly, live in the moment. And yeah, I couldn't think of a way to incorporate it in the video, but even though I did quit boxing, eventually 2 years later I joined my university's boxing team, where I made a lot of meaningful connections and memories, and more importantly, found value in the sport that's defined so much of who I am, and I think that's why I felt like I had to make a video like this. Outside of that, I just want to say thank you guys so much for helping me hit 8,000 subscribers. I only started making videos in January and did not think that I would reach this point, so once again, thank you guys so much. If you guys could help me hit 10,000 subscribers by the end of the year, that would be absolutely insane. And outside of that, don't forget to like and comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this video, whether they be good, bad, or something you can add. #bars. And God bless. I hope you have a good day. Mwah.